Hello everyone and welcome back to Presidio Bay. With the city of Santa Isadora in smoldering ruins and more than 250,000 people displaced and homeless, the race was on to provide essentials of food, water, and shelter. The first challenge was the city's water supply. Although the city's main reservoirs had survived largely intact, the earthquake had shattered brittle cast iron and terracotta pipes, destroying the existing water supply and sewer systems. Although there was a dire need for clean drinking water, the main motive for restoring the water system was fear of additional fires. The first set of repairs to the water supply system were quick patch jobs, designed to put fire hydrants back into service and refill firefighting reservoirs. The Army did much of this repair work, laying pipes above ground, along roads to bypass heavily damaged sections of underground water mains. The first drinking water, meanwhile, was brought in by the Navy, who also supplied the city with fresh milk. As news about the earthquake spread, food donations from all over the country came in quickly, overwhelming the city's Citizens Relief Committee. Transportation of food was handled mostly by rail. E.H. Harriman, the director of several railroads, including the Coast Range, personally dispatched hundreds of relief trains. Within days, almost 1,400 cars of food, tools, and medical supplies rolled into Santa Isadora. To prevent additional fires, cooking was banned, which made food distribution more difficult. After initial reluctance, the Army took over the task, constructing 9 commissaries and providing meals for more than 300,000 people.
With food and water secured, shelter became the next priority. Shantytowns were hastily built in parks and empty lots, skirting the no cooking regulations with a strict cook outside in the street policy to prevent more fires. These shantytowns were constructed from anything that builders could find, from debris and stolen construction material to the bodies of old rail cars and cable cars. The survivors built on undeveloped land on the outer fringes of the city, far from the worst effects of the fire. Almost overnight, new neighborhoods such as Carville, named for its use of passenger cars as houses, sprang up on the western edge of the peninsula. In order to keep these communities healthy, despite the squalid conditions, the Board of Health, the Army, and the Red Cross dispatched 500 physicians. They regularly inspected the shantytowns to ensure that they stayed clean and their residents stayed healthy.
The Army, in search of a cleaner and more orderly solution, created 26 formal camps, which would eventually house around 20,000 people in standard Sibley tents. The military's strict protocols and tight control kept these settlements clean and safe. Communities quickly formed, with specifically named streets and addresses for the tents. The camps were not without problems, most notably the segregation of Chinese people. Chinatown was one of the hardest-hit neighborhoods. What little that survived the fire was looted when police left the neighborhood unwatched. As a result, the neighborhood's 15,000 Chinese people lost everything. After the earthquake and fires, nearly all of Chinatown's displaced residents left Santa Isadora for Encinal across the bay. Only about 400 stayed in Santa Isadora, and the Army segregated them to their own camp, then repeatedly moved that camp further and further away from the center of the city. Eventually, the Army's Chinese camp was placed on a far-flung corner of the Presidio, where high winds and low temperatures prevented any form of comfortable life.
As the year went on and rebuilding continued, the tent camps were dismantled and replaced with more robust earthquake shacks. Designed for quick construction, these compact shelters were rugged enough for the mid-50s weather of a Bay Area winter. The Army built more than 5,000 of these shacks, eventually housing more than 16,000 people. The Army sold the structures to refugees in a rent-to-own scheme, where the rent of $2 per month was put towards a $50 purchase price. Once paid off, the shack had to be moved from the camp. Many of the city's displaced renters capitalized on this opportunity to become homeowners, and after relocation, the shacks were often combined, added onto, and improved. 114 years later, some earthquake shacks survive, and some have sold for over $2 million. Of the handful of shacks surviving today, 2 are restored and on display in the Presidio, and 2 originals survive at the Oakland estuary.
Fundraising from all over the country provided monetary relief to the city and survivors. Over $5 million was raised. Robber barons such as Andrew Carnegie donated large sums, and fundraising events, including a special baseball game in Gramercy, were held to support Santa Isadorans. Local banks had been slow to rebuild, partly because the thick steel vaults took nearly a month to cool down to be safe enough to enter. Once they reopened for business, residents were able to secure financial backing and insurance payouts for a more substantial rebuilding effort. Cleanup efforts all over the bay began with purely manual and animal labor. Over 50 million tons of debris were carted away or sorted into piles for disposal or reuse. Adding to the challenge of cleanup were the hundreds of precarious, partially collapsed structures still standing throughout the city. These were dynamited and demolished, reducing them to rubble, thankfully without mishap. Eager for big government contracts from the cleanup operation, the Coast Range, the Springwood Lines, and other railroads and streetcar operators were granted the ability to lay temporary tracks on city streets, allowing trains to move rubble out of the city faster. More than 800 track gangs worked at a frenzied pace to clear the way and install rail. These tracks were laid on top of the roads, and the haphazard construction meant that many streets were now impossible to cross, with relatively few ramps to provide crossings scattered around the city.
Almost a month later, these tracks had been laid, but not a single wheel had turned to assist in the cleanup efforts. The railroad's progress had stalled as management struggled to work with the government and each other to settle on rates for debris removal. After some deliberation, the railroads were finally goaded into operating as a single unit. While the railroads argued and bickered, survivors performed the back-breaking manual labor to clean up the rubble from all over town. Teams of horses and wagons were always in short supply, and all too often were worked to death. Huge quantities of rubble were brought by horse cart to a ship coaling dock near the ferry building to be dumped onto barges. These barges, under order of the U.S. Army, were required to be dumped into the ocean outside the Golden Gate. But on many a foggy night, the sailors saved time by illegally dumping boatloads of debris behind nearby Cabra Buena Island. Authorities only found out that this had happened when the freshly relayed underwater telephone cables were damaged by dumped building debris. Debris not hauled into the water was deposited at 10 locations. Most of this went into the marshy, shallow land around Mission Bay. The rest ended up near Islay Creek, in the Dog Patch, and along the Embarcadero north of the ferry building and in North Beach.
Salvage operations for brick, metals, and wood popped up everywhere. While broken bricks were crushed for gravel, intact bricks, metal, and undamaged pieces of wood were highly sought after for reuse. As rubble was sorted and prepared, architects and contractors began to discover patterns in what had survived the shaking. One of the first major discoveries was that the mortar used in most brick buildings turned to dust as soon as any shaking started, but left the bricks intact. It was this mortar failure that had caused many seemingly overbuilt structures to disintegrate and collapse. A second finding was that the cheaper buildings built of old-growth redwood fared better. Unlike masonry, the wood flexed with the earthquake. The damage that had been done to wood buildings consisted almost entirely of fire and soil collapse. Most of these structures required only moderate repairs to get back to a livable condition. This surprised many residents who derided the wooden structures as cheap imitations of masonry buildings. In the end, it was the wooden buildings, cheaper and less fashionable, that survived in much greater numbers, while the more permanent and luxurious homes of the wealthy had crumbled to dust. At the time, seismology was not a scientific or architectural focus, and very few large buildings had been braced or dampened in any intentional way. One notable exception was the legendary Montgomery Block, which had been built at great expense to be both fireproof and earthquake-resistant. Thanks to thick walls and a seismically isolated base, these precautions worked, saving the Montgomery Block from disaster.
Not to let a crisis go to waste, politicians and builders fought for attention by proposing huge plans for restoration and reconstruction of the city. Santa Isadora's mayor tried to capitalize on the disaster by telegraphing major cities around the US and Europe, putting out a message calling upon the Western world's best architects to help rebuild. Local architects, including a young Julia Morgan and Bernard Maybeck, signed on to major rebuilding projects, boosting their careers. Some architects floated grand plans to transform the city. The boldest was architect Daniel Burnham's plan to rebuild the city into I Can't Believe It's Not Paris, complete with grand boulevards radiating from a new civic center. Crafted in 1905, Burnham's plans had been stalled by the cost and complications of the enormous demolition they would have required. Advocates of the plan pointed out that the earthquake and fires had done that work for free, so why not take advantage of it? The rush to recovery forever ended the Burnham plan. Eager to get back into business, property owners began reconstruction as soon as they could, ignoring the plan and cementing into place the pre-disaster street grid and property line patterns. Many city leaders tried to use the destruction for more nefarious purposes. Driven by a combination of racism and greed, community members formed a committee and fought to move Chinatown from its valuable land near downtown to a remote point far to the south. To those on the committee, which included the mayor, the total destruction of Chinatown and the temporary exodus of its residents was the opportunity not to be missed. The Chinese government intervened, sending diplomats to tell the governor of Kostamoa that the empress was angry and that if they were not allowed to rebuild their consulate in Chinatown, they would not rebuild at all and cut off the region's lucrative trade with China.
Meanwhile, the local Chinese community responded by rebuilding as fast as possible. Using heat-warped clinker bricks, the community hastily reconstructed new, robust structures, re-establishing Chinatown on the ruins of their old neighborhood. As a result of this fast rebuilding, Chinatown preserved much of the early infrastructure of the city within its limits, including a vast network of alleyways. Quick rebuilding and diplomatic pressure won, and Chinatown was preserved, keeping the developers out. Like Chinatown, nearby North Beach recovered quickly. The entire gulch along Garibaldi Avenue was filled with new mixed-use buildings, with a substantial number of them catering to the neighborhood's Italian population. A vast majority of the structures built after the fire survive into the 21st century with only modest modification. These two shots show how much of a difference a couple years made. All over the city, neighborhoods and people settled into a productive rhythm, cleaning, repairing, and rebuilding. Trains and ships carrying lumber, steel, furniture, glass, electrical wire, plumbing parts, and paint flowed into the city to provide raw resources for the massive reconstruction efforts. Like the phoenix on the city's flag, Santa Isadora once again began to rise from the ashes.
If you like this episode, want first access to future episodes, or would like early access to the custom assets used in Presidio Bay, please consider joining our Patreon. Every dollar put in goes directly into improving the series, from custom commissioned assets to in-depth research to helping with the costs of making these videos. For as little as $1 a month, you can be a part of making Presidio Bay a success. Join at patreon.com/Presidio Bay. And remember to subscribe here for more videos, asset creation streams, and other updates. You can follow me on Twitter at bsquikel and Interurban Era at interurban_e. Our next episode will be on my channel, Bsquikelhausen. The link is in the description. Don't forget to head over there to continue the story. Before we go, we'd like to extend our gratitude to the incredible Tom Coletti, at Tom Coletti on Twitter, for the fantastic Presidio Bay theme music. And of course, thank you to all of our patrons for making this series possible. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Presidio Bay.